now going to begin our breakout on seeing Scripture through Jewish eyes. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Jo Bruce. She identifies as an Orthodox Jew, is originally from London, England, and has lived in the United States for 7 years. She is currently teaching texts from Hebrew Bible and Jewish law to junior high students, but has been teaching Jewish studies to middle schoolers, high schoolers, and adults for 20 years. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Jo Bruce.
So they say, never start with an apology. So I'm sorry. If you don't understand something I'm saying, it's either because I'm talking British or because I'm talking Jewish. It could be either one. Either way, please stop me and just say, what was that? That was weird. Say it. Because I've been British all my life and I've been teaching Jewish for a very long time, I tend to forget that other people don't necessarily know the words that I know. So I might need reminding. Okay. So a bit about who I am. I taught in adult education, Jewish adult education, in London for 13 years. And then we decided to move to the States. That's a whole other story. And moving to the States, I began teaching in schools. So I moved from adult Jewish education into regular Jewish education. I think it's important to say that I identify as an Orthodox Jew because I definitely come with a bias and a perspective that other Jews who don't identify as Orthodox might have different views from me on the Bible, on teaching the Bible, on the values that go with that, and the method of teaching Bible. So it is important for you to know that I am coming with that perspective. I teach here in Beechwood. I teach in an Orthodox Jewish school here in Beechwood. I literally dashed out of a classroom this morning to come here. That's what it really is my day job every day. And we think about what we're doing. We're a school that really thinks about why we're doing it and what we're doing it. And for my entire career, that's been something that I have been doing. It's not by rote. Like, if I'm going to do this, why am I doing it? And what is it for? So that's part of what I'm going to be presenting to you today. So I hope you've all got an outline in front of you, like a handout. It has the outline for the class, for the session today, and then some text study is at the end, 2 different sections when we get to that. So you can follow along on the slides, or you can follow along on the handout, and then we'll be referring to those additional text studies as we go. Okay. So I have my own Bible, right? As a Jew, I come with my own Bible. So normally, sort of technically, it's referred to as the Hebrew Bible. I will call it Tanakh. That's how I talk about my Bible. I will talk about Tanakh. This is an acronym, the T, N, and Ch sound. See, that's the challenge, right? Tanakh. I know that's not easy. So the T stands for Torah. It's sometimes also called Chumash. Chumash meaning 5, because there are 5 books. The N is for Nevi'im, which is the prophets. And the Ch is for Ketuvim, the writings. Okay? So I will probably call it Tanakh. Today, you now know what the word is, so when you hear it, it should be familiar, we should be good to go. I will interchange with Bible or Tanakh or Torah. Okay. The first thing I teach my students is the only answer they need to know is, it depends. Whatever question you're asked, the answer is, well, it depends. So, ask me how many books there are in the Hebrew Bible, in Tanakh. My answer is, well, it depends. So, are there 24 books? Are there 27 books? Are there 38 books? Well, it depends. And it depends on how you count them. So, okay. This slide actually was created by my work in London for a course that they ran, teaching the entire Jewish Bible in 1 year. That was the goal. So this was from the first session, and it's a comparison between what we say is the Bible and what Protestants say is the Bible, Catholics say is the Bible. I am not here to tell you your religion. So if there's a mistake on here, please tell me and I'll let them know in London. But things to notice just from this slide is it seems that we have a lot fewer books. Right? Even if you compare what we call Tanakh to the Old Testament, it seems like we have fewer books. And we can see it's 24 books on this list because Samuel 1 and 2 is counted as one book. Because Kings 1 and 2 is counted as one book. Because Chronicles 1 and 2 are counted as one book. And the 12 minor prophets are counted as one book and not 12. And that's the difference in the numbers. Okay. The order, it's not just fewer books, but actually the order is different. And it's the order that the book's in is very crucial to understanding or to approaching, studying and learning of the Hebrew Bible, because they are divided by the depth of revelation required to produce the book. That's how the sections are divided. The first 5 books were direct revelation from God. They were given to Moses on the Mount Sinai. Direct revelation, word for word. That's the belief. But word for word, they were dictated. This is the word, the voice of God. Word for word. It was then written down. That's the first 5 books. You then have the prophets, and that is a revelation direct from God to a single individual in a dream, in a moment, in a waking vision, but not, first of all, not mass revelation, but also not clear. The term is that it was seen through a clouded glass. So even though you could say in the first 5 books, every single word is crucial and the voice of God, in the prophets, the message is the message of God. The words are the words of human beings. That's how that middle section works. So it's been divided into 2, and that's not in terms of revelation, just in terms of style and content. The first are more history-based, and the second are the more vision-based books. They're called early and later. That's a misnomer, I have to say, because the Book of Kings spans all this time. So the Book of Kings is as late as the prophets. It's the same time period. It's not a time thing. The last section, the writings. So that section is inspired by God. This is written by a human being who is in tune with God. Their lives run parallel with God and were so in tune with God that they wrote something that is considered special and holy and worth preserving, but does not have a direct revelation from God. They were in a religious moment when those books were written. They weren't necessarily, it wasn't a revelation, a vision, a communication from God. Now, as I'm saying this in my head, I'm thinking, what about the book of Daniel? Now, as a sideline, I really love the book of Daniel. I'm slightly obsessed with it, and I teach it a lot. So most things in my head end up with, oh, but what about the book of Daniel? Of course, there's a lot of visions and revelations in the book of Daniel, and that seems to be out of place. But that very question is so core when you learn the book of Daniel. What's it doing here? Is this not a vision? Is there a doubt that these are visions? And it's a really potent question within that book. It seems to be in the wrong place. So the fact that it's there speaks very loudly that maybe there's a doubt that this is a vision on the same level or in the same way as the prophet section. That's just the highlight. Okay. So the sections. This is the first section, the section of Torah. Just to point out that the Jewish Bible has different names. Just last week, one of my students were really proud of themselves that they knew the Latin names for the books. They were like, oh, is that Leviticus? Because in an Orthodox Jewish school setting, even in adult education, rarely are these names used. We will use and we will talk about constantly the Hebrew names, and they will be that's the language that we use. So the Hebrew names are very important. It is very different, whereas the Latin names are about the content of the book, right? They're seen to really describe the book, whereas the Hebrew names come from the very first sentence of the book. That's how the Hebrew names arrive. Right? So certainly in the 5 first books. So Bereshit is the first word, and Shemot is the second word of the book, and that's how it appears. So Jews like to come up with big ideas. So of course there are big ideas about why that really is a summary of the book, but it's not. It's the second word. I mean, it's the second word of the book. Okay. So these are the books in prophets and the books and the writings in Ketuvim. Okay. Right. When I thought about how I approach learning Tanakh, learning Bible, the first thing I think about is a woman who died in 1992 at the age of 94. She either died in 1994 at the age of 92 or died in 1992 at the age of 94. Could go either way. She was born in Riga in Latvia and moved to Israel before the establishment of the state. She was a very sweet little old lady by the end who continued to teach Torah into her 90s. Her name is Nechama Leibowitz, and she revolutionized Jewish Tanakh education. Every teacher I have ever learned from taught me using her methodology without ever saying, I teach using this methodology, and this is the starting place for teaching Tanakh. Every Torah teacher starts here. They might eventually then go on to do something different, but they will start with the rules and the methodology that she came up with. She has an interesting life. Having moved to Israel, she never ever left. They offered her huge sums of money to leave. She never would leave. When they said, but you'll get paid a fortune, I love this quote, she said, but you can't eat breakfast twice. And she had 2 suits, and she would just wash one, wear one, and that was it, like her entire life. She wore hats like I. She had 2 berets, one to go with the brown suit, one to go with the blue suit. That was it. She lived an incredibly simple life and dedicated her whole life to teaching Torah. She was married but was childless, and that was and one of the things that did was really connect her with her students. So they connected with her. Okay. So what did she have to say? What was the revolution? Until she came along, Jewish education was about learning Jewish law. The Jewish Bible had been mostly sidelined to something you hear in the synagogue on Sabbath. It was really something to tell stories to the small children in kindergarten, but as soon as they're old enough, you should do proper learning. You should learn Jewish law. Right? Graduating to the Talmud, the study of Talmud. Right? Talmud study is still very important, but when Nechama came along and she said, how can you ignore the voice of God? How can you miss the voice of God that is in the Bible, in the Tanakh? If you skip learning Torah, you are avoiding listening to and connecting with the voice of God. And so she really brought it back into the classroom and brought it back onto everyone's radar, right, and raised its profile. There was an approach to teaching and to learning Bible that said, essentially, that the learning process was finished. That in the medieval era, when the commentators were learning Bible and they came up with their understanding of the Bible, that was the understanding. We now know what it says, right? It has been set in stone. And so, in order to learn the Bible, all you needed to do was read the commentary, and now we know what it says. And Nechama said that we need to bring this text to life. She used the term a Torat Chaim, a Torah of life. Chaim being the word for life, Torat Chaim. That it should be a living Torah. And we should bring it to life because the voice of God is as relevant and as loud and as powerful today as it was in the medieval time. And that you have to struggle and connect each person today and now every time you learn the Bible, and it isn't stuck in the medieval time. So how do we do this? So the first is that you use questions. It's a process. It isn't a finished object. So you tackle the text. The text is so complex. Start with the questions. Why does it say that? Why does it use that word when it could use another? Why did it miss out some information that seems so crucial? Why did it put in information that seems so irrelevant? Right? Did I really need to know that? Ask questions. And then to look at the plain meaning of the text. The idea that the text could be understood without the medieval commentary. That they were two separate things. So I'm going to mention a medieval commentary. Now, his name was Rashi. I don't remember what his name is. And Rashi is the commentary. If you ask small children a commentary on the Bible, they will say Rashi. It's like the one that everybody knows. Right? You learn Chumash and Rashi. You learn Bible and Rashi. And it became synonymous with one another. Right? And it continues to be thought of that way in many Orthodox circles. Right? I said when my daughters were in kindergarten, were little in school, and I spoke to their teacher and I said, why are you not teaching the plain meaning of the text? Why are you bringing in stories that come from outside of the text? Why are we not focusing on what the Bible actually says? And she replied, oh, I only teach the plain meaning of the text. I only teach that way. I teach Chumash with Rashi. In her head, those Chumash with this other commentary was the plain meaning, and the plain meaning could not be understood without it. But Nechama said, yes, there is that plain sense of the text, the voice of God in and of itself, the words that are there. That's the starting point. Because the text can be understood in so many different ways. There isn't one way of understanding the text. And if you close it down to one commentary, then you have shut off all the possibilities. We say that the Torah has 70 faces. 70 is a very powerful number. It means everything. It doesn't mean 70. The number 70 doesn't mean literally 70. It means every possibility. We talk about 70 nations in the world. It doesn't mean there are 70 nations. It means that the world is filled with everything, every possibility of nationality. Right? Every possibility. So the Torah has 70 faces. It has every possibility of interpretation, essentially. And that each person who comes can bring a new understanding. There's possibility. There's a possibility each time you approach the text for something new. And if you don't start with a foundation, the text itself, you're not able to bring something new because you already have the answer to the questions that we had. So she really focused on the importance of this word pshat, the plain meaning of the text. In order to hear, in order to hear the voice of God, like these are literally the words of God. That's how we feel when we learn this text, that God is talking to us. Okay. There is a belief that every word was intentional, right? It comes with that belief that it's the word of God. So when you learn the first 5 books, there's a belief that every word, that the form of the word, so it's number and gender and tense, was chosen deliberately. It's not arbitrary, right? It could have been, my grammar's terrible. It could have been a past tense or a past participle. There are 2 different forms, and if it's choosing one form over another, that's deliberate. If it's written in the masculine when it could be in the feminine, that's deliberate. Or the feminine when it could be the masculine, that's deliberate. There's a particular name of God used, right? There are many names of God in the Bible, many. And if it chooses a particular name of God in a particular text, it was intentional. It's there to teach us something about this text. So we have to learn to be very sensitive to these choices because they are there to give us a message. Okay. Okay. We do need commentary, and we use commentary all the time. And most commentary is medieval, but not always. It's not always from the medieval period. There is midrash, which goes before. Midrash is 500 to 1200, that sort of time period, CE, and it is the early rabbinic response to the Bible text, really exploring not just in order to understand, but the why of the text. It will a creative response to what is this text doing, why is it doing it, why do I need it, what can I learn from it. So the Midrash is the earliest sort of rabbinic response. It was written at the same time as the Talmud, so it is early, followed by a period, a very, very productive period of commentary in the medieval times, but bringing it up to the modern era as well. And certainly, again, the 19th century was very productive in terms of biblical commentary, and today also there is new commentary that comes out. There is ability to bring a new response to the text. And the point of all this is to connect to the text, and through that to God, that this is part of the journey. This is what we're doing it for. When we approach the text, it isn't just to understand the text itself, but to understand our relationship to the Jewish people and to God. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to interrupt. Yes. Yes.
So the way that you explain kind of the difference in the understanding of the revelation,
yes,
that accompanied with, you mentioned you're coming from the orthodox perspective, would conservative or reform have different opinions about that, and what would those be?
Okay. They would.
Okay.
The conservative community does believe in a revelation, right? That there was a revelation to the people on Sinai, but the writing down of that revelation was not instantaneous, and therefore they ascribe less certainty to the text. The Reform movement and beyond, I know less about, but they don't necessarily believe in a revelation. They don't necessarily believe in that the text is godly or has that level of definitiveness. Right? and this is why I wanted to say that I am orthodox, because because it's important when we approach the text. When I approach the text, I am seeing it as that every letter and every word has a message. Now, Shakespeare also had a message, but if he used the instead of and, or what, no one's going to say, well, what does that mean, right? It might mean, or it might not mean anything at all, because he was Shakespeare and he doesn't need to, every word doesn't need to mean something. For me, every word in the Torah means something and can be explored, investigated, and there can be a message and a meaning there. And they might not necessarily be the same questions or the same answers that somebody who's coming from a non-orthodox perspective have, certainly in terms of biblical criticism. That is not something that has been adopted mostly by the Orthodox community, and that is not the approach that we take. There are, of course, exceptions to every rule. And I think that is a big difference between the Orthodox community and the non-Orthodox community, is how much they focus on and rely on biblical criticism and have accepted that approach. The Orthodox world, that is not our approach to studying Bible. That's important to know. Okay, so we have all this commentary. It's incredibly important. It's part of the learning process. What is it coming? Right? How does it arrive? And it arrives from problems in the text. Okay? So just to look at, what do I mean when I say that there's a problem or an issue in the text? Okay, I love this word. This is essentially what I've been talking about, which is Omni Significance. It was coined by a modern scholar called James Kugel. It's the idea that every detail of the Bible contains meaning. Right? There are stories that every crown on a letter has meaning. Now, those meanings have actually been lost over the millennial of time, but that every word, every conjunctive, right? The ands and even the ands are significant in the Hebrew Bible. Right? It's not there by chance, even the ands. Okay, so that's the first thing, that take every single word seriously because they are omni-significant, as in every word is as equally significant. Okay, gap filling. This is a big thing because there's a ton of stuff missed out. It's just like you read a story and you're like, hold on a minute, how did they get there? Or you'll read a story and it'll be, well, it doesn't say who they are. I don't know who you're talking about. Or you'll get to a story and they've entirely changed location. Or somebody's missing. 10 people went somewhere, 6 of them returned. Where did they all go? What happened? Right? That idea that there is missing information, and it's possible to fill those gaps meaningfully. And that's what's really interesting, is that when we fill the gaps, it is not to tell us history. History is not important, was not as important. That things happened, lovely. That things happened and have meaning and continue to have meaning, now that's important. Teaching my students this week the book of Samuel, and we were learning a section where Saul goes to look for his father's donkeys. That's a nice story. It's really funny. We had a whole discussion about how silly donkeys are. Donkeys are silly. But that's the point of this story. Did Saul really go look for donkeys? Or was he a human being who was willing to go look for a silly animal? That he isn't a human being who wants to run after honor, even though he's about to be made king. But he's somebody who's very uncomfortable with honor and recognition. And that's part of his character. And how does the text indicate that? By making him chase after donkeys. Because you don't get anything as silly as a donkey. Right? The Bible warns against kings chasing after horses. Right? But that is one of the rules, is that kings should not chase after horses. So And the example of the first king is somebody who doesn't chase after, or is willing to chase after, donkeys and not horses. So the fact that we notice these things, the fact that we're called to notice that Saul chased a donkey, it's that tiny detail. Right? But then we have to fill in the story. Right? Then we might need to fill in the details around that. But the stories that when we fill in a story, when we add detail, it's there to bring meaning, modern meaning to us. What does this mean? The most famous example of this is the story of Abraham and how he gets chosen by God. I don't know whether this has made it out of the Jewish community. So if I were to ask you, why does Abraham get chosen to be Abraham, the Abraham that he's going to be by God? When God tells him, go from your land, go set up a whole new regime in the land of Canaan, why does God choose Abraham? Is there any suggestion? I don't know. Okay, so in the Jewish tradition, there is a story. Abraham lives in a family of idol worshippers, in a town full of idol worshippers, in a city full of idol worshippers. And his dad, his business was to sell idols. And his father goes out of town one day and says, Abraham, stay home, look after the idol shop. The end of the story is, having contemplated long and hard, he decides he's going to smash the idols completely because he's decided he doesn't want to be an idol worshipper anymore, and he puts the hammer that he used to smash the idols into the hand of the biggest, meanest looking idol. His dad gets home. Oy vey, Avraham, what have you done? Avraham says, oh, it wasn't me, it was the idol. It's like, and he forces Terah to confront his own reality that he knows that the idol cannot do that. He knows that the idol did not possess the ability to exert the idol's will on the world and destroy the other idols. So Abraham forces his father to confront that reality. His father's response is denial. And he sells his son. He doesn't sell him. He ships him off to the king to be thrown into a fiery furnace, which Abraham survives. Now that whole story, the whole story of Abraham destroying idols, of killing his father and not getting away with it, of his father sending him off to the king to be killed, of him surviving the fiery furnace, every single child in an orthodox Jewish school have spent at least an hour trying to find that story in the Bible and being very confused as to why it's not there. Because it's so much part of our education that is why Abraham was chosen. And surprise, it's not there. Right? It's not there. Did it really happen? I don't care. That's not what it's, right? That's an important thing. I don't mind if it happened or not. It's there because I can learn about Abraham, about God, about his father, about the society from that story. Yes?
Is the story Talmudic?
It is midrashic.
Okay.
Same time period, as I said, this other, yes, it's very early. Yes, relatively, 2,000-year history. So it is really part of our culture. It is a story that teaches so much and is so impactful on our understanding of who Abraham is. To the extent I hinted at the story when I spoke to my students this morning. Like, it really is, we're in that parsha. Every week we read a small section of Torah in synagogue. This week is the section on Abraham. So in honor of Abraham, we're talking about Abraham today. Yes?
So, even if he's not in the scripture, is the expectation that these stories would be consistent with what is? So, like, the story makes sense because he's so monotheistic?
Correct. It has to be consistent.
Right.
It has to be consistent, yes. And when it isn't, that's another, right? You get to ask another question. Well, that isn't consistent. Why is that not consistent? Okay, so that brings me perfectly to number 3, which is resolving contradictory verses. Right? You want things, there is a desire for consistency. Right? So commentary has to be consistent with the verses in Torah, and it's problematic, or it's certainly questionable when it's not. And the verses themselves sometimes contradict, and they need to be resolved. How do you smooth over those contradictions? Context is often the answer, or time, or there's context is often how those verses, those contradictions are smoothed over. But certainly you have to start with the question before you come up with the solution. And then the last. This idea of there being an oral tradition, sometimes the answer is because it says so, but it says so in the oral tradition, along with a written tradition from Sinai, that revelation. There's also an oral tradition that God had too much to say, and Moses couldn't write it all down, and it was intentional. Right? Keeping some things oral and not writing everything down brings flexibility and an increased likelihood of relevance to a tradition. Right? So that idea of there being an oral tradition along with the written tradition is very strong. And so sometimes a commentary will intervene and say, I know it says that, but our oral tradition says this. A great example of this is an eye for an eye. Right? The pasuk that says you should, when some damage has been done, you can expect, in place of the eye that was taken, you give an eye, right? A tooth for a tooth. So the oral tradition says it never means that literally. It cannot possibly mean that literally. That doesn't make logical sense, because you can never figure it out fairly, and justice and fairness are the underlying principles of the religion, and therefore, since it cannot be ever done fairly, my eye is not worth the same as your eye. My tooth is not worth the same as your tooth. Right? An eye to a 10-year-old is not the same as an eye to a 90-year-old. If it can't be universally fair, it can't be true. The oral tradition says that means money. Right? And so when you approach the verse in Torah, you approach it with that background of the oral Torah, saying this automatically means money. Like that will be, nobody says this means it literally, because the oral tradition in that case is so strong that it means something different. Okay, so let's learn some text. Keep an eye on that. I talk a lot. Let's learn some text. Okay. Right. So on your handout, on page 5. So this text study is a lesson that was actually taught by Nechama Leibowitz. Okay, so we are stepping into her shoes, and we are seeing we're going to try and see the learning of these verses from Torah from her perspective. We also get to bring our own, so that's really important. Okay, so have a look at the verses on the top. What problems do you see with the verses? These are from Genesis chapter 30, and they are to do with the story of Rachel and Jacob, who are married. Now, unfortunately, Jacob also married her sister. There was a bit of confusion at the wedding. He ends up with 2 wives. And Rachel is his beloved wife, and Leah, her sister, is the one with all the children. Leah has many, many children, and Rachel still has none. She is desperate for children. That is definitely a theme in Torah, right? The childless and the need for children. It's definitely a theme, and here we see that in this story. So that's the context of these verses. Would someone like to read, other than me? Yes, fabulous. Can you just say your name?
Kristen.
Hi, Kristen.
Hi. When Rachel saw she had borne no children to Jacob, Rachel became jealous of her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me
when we read these verses, let's begin to look at them critically. What issues, what questions might we have on these verses? Yes.
The word "to" seems maybe odd, as if it could be replaced with "she had borne no children with Jacob, Jacob from Jacob."
Right. Okay. Okay. Good point. This is English. Okay. So the Bible isn't written in English. So the fact that we're looking at this in translation, the same rules of careful language don't necessarily apply in that way, right? In a way that it would apply in the Hebrew, which I carefully took off all the sheets so that you guys wouldn't freak out. It could be that does exist in the Hebrew itself, right? But we don't have the Hebrew in front of us, so that type of question is a very good question. I don't know if it's relevant in this case here.
It depends.
Right, it depends. Fabulous. My work here is done. Okay, yes, any other?
How do you make sense of that then? For like keeping the Omni Significance.
Yes.
And how do we like make sure we have an appreciation for that when using translation?
Okay.
Because then there's also like a lot of like, you know.
No, because I hope I get it, because that's my slide at the end, which is, what do we actually do in school, right?
Okay.
That's exactly that decision. What do we actually do in school? And that tension that prioritizing the learning of the Hebrew language and accessing the texts in their original language because of this issue. We're constantly trying to get the students to go back to the original text. It is such a battle. And every time, they're struggling with something, and you're like, that's because you're in the translation. Now let's go back to the text. What does that mean in the original? So the focus on language, but of course, when you're studying a language, what you might be missing out on is the meaning making, right? So there's the tension there. But I was hoping to get to it at the end. Right. Does anyone have problems in the text? Yes.
It seems as though Rachel's plea demands that we ask, what does she think is going to happen? Why? As she's making the plea as if she's assuming there is something that Jacob could be doing that he's not doing.
Right. What can he do about it? Can he do something about it? What is she
Maybe he's
expecting?
not, because it doesn't say
Right.
how often they've been attempting.
Correct. Why is it not happening? We also know, right? Clearly the problem's not with him.
Well, one possibility is that he's not doing something.
Right.
Another possibility is there's something other than what you would normally do that he could do that he's not doing.
Right. Correct. Right. Yes, go on.
The other question I is like, why did Jacob overreact so bad? Like, he seems to really overreact to something. I don't know. It reminds me of like a marital spat in my own home. Like, I say something just to say it, and then be like, I didn't.
Right. This is who's right. And now we've got to the crux of the issue. Right. Who's not doing their job? Is it him? Right. He's getting angry with her. She's getting angry with him. Why are they getting angry with each other? Also, aren't they supposed to be kind of like good human beings? Why is anger and why are they speaking to each other in this way? How is that acceptable? That these human beings who we're supposed to be learning from and so wonderful and lofty and aren't you such a great example? And then you read these verses and you're like, well, that's not nice. What's going, right? This is exactly where the commentaries go with this issue, right? This issue of why are these two human beings not being nice to each other in this circumstance, right? Is there the assumption being, the underlying assumption being is they're not terrible people, right? We're not watching, the Housewives of Beverly Hills or whatever. These are not people who are constantly fighting, are constantly getting into, spats with each other. They're not mean, selfish, revolting human beings. That's the underlying assumption. And if we start off from that place, then, Okay, well, why are they behaving like this? What's motivating this behavior? Okay.
Is it possible for the people attending via Zoom to see the text that you're
They have it. It's in the handout, which they got a copy of. So
Okay.
it's on page 5 of the handout.
Okay.
It's on my thing. I think they could download it from the Zoom, from the website.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, it is.
Send them that link.
So it isn't on my slides because because I want them to be able to interact with it themselves. So they should be able to. What I want us to do now is for you to look at the commentary that's on this page. There are 4 different commentaries, 4 different time periods, 4 different locations, and to look at this question too. So look at the commentaries on the verse. What problems in the verse are they answering? Each source might focus on a different problem. Who's in the wrong? What did they do wrong? And then what do you think of the answer that they give? So really focus on who is in the wrong and what did they do wrong. Right, the different commentary will come up with a different answer. So, Jewish learning. We use a word called chavrita. A chaver is a friend. So when you learn, you're meeting with a friend. You're meeting with an other. 2 is better than 1. So, what I'd like you to do is do some Jewish chavrita learning. Pair up, or a 3, if it doesn't work out as a pair. You can actually move around the room. If you're on your own, if you're on Zoom, then 1 will have to do. Read the commentary out loud to each other. And then the person who didn't read should maybe summarize what they heard. Right? And then you can then reflect, yes, that's what I understood too, or no, I didn't understand it in this way. So one person reads, the second person summarizes what they heard, and then you can comment on what you heard, back and forth, and then reflect on the questions, which, who's in the wrong, what did they do wrong? Try and get through the 4 commentaries. Don't get sucked in too deeply, but give it a go. Are we back? Right, let's bring our thoughts back and bring your ideas together. Let's share our ideas. I know that the texts were difficult. You can imagine reading them in medieval Hebrew, which is completely different, let me tell you. Like the grammar, it's not the words, but the grammar is completely different, and that throws you. So, source number 1, Rabbi David Kimchi. Who was in the wrong, and what did they do wrong? Who was in the wrong, and what did they do wrong? Yes.
Rachel was in the wrong because she asked for the wrong thing.
Okay. Rachel was in the wrong. There's going to be a theme going on. What did she do wrong? Like, what was it? Did she ask the wrong thing?
What?
Did she ask the wrong thing, or did she ask in the wrong way? Does anyone? Yes, go.
She was asking in the wrong way because she was trying to basically take the place of God and saying, you need to do this, or else, like...
Right.
Yeah.
Who does she think is God? God-like? Jacob. Right?
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is his anger justified? If Rachel thinks that Jacob has godly powers, why is his anger justified? Yes?
She's making
granddad, like smashed way back then. What you're going to come along and reintroduce this? We're just starting on a project here to bring monotheism to the world, and you're going to bring back idolatry? Really? We're going to go there? That's what he's saying. Right? This project that we're on is too fundamentally important for you to mess it up with your dodgy approaches to the world. Like, let's stay on message here. That's what he, right? And is it something that is suitable to get angry about? Well, maybe, right? If he really felt that the whole system was going to be undermined by her views and by her attitudes, then maybe it was a project important enough for him to get angry. Right? How do I know that that isn't the only way I can see this? Because everyone else says something else, right? So, okay, we're going to park that idea. Moving on to number 2, the Ikeda Yitzhak. So, what did number, it was quite long, but who was in the wrong and what was the crime? Can anyone? Yes.
Rachel's still wrong because she's forgetting that life has purpose even without children.
Right. That life has purpose even without children. Right? To undermine the fundamental value of a human being, to think that any human being is only valuable if they are able to produce children. You know, that's an incredibly powerful, strong message, and I would like to point out that he had this message in somewhere around, right, 1450, let's say, right? That's quite a while ago to have such an important and impressive message to say that every single person should be judged on what they do and not on what they produce from their wombs. Right? That's not where value lies. I think that's an incredibly powerful message from so long ago. Okay, number 3, yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Real quick.
Yes.
Because it mentions the matriarchs and the religious women and the prophetesses. I'm making an assumption that all this midrash is coming from male sources.
Yes, they are all male.
Does this, is there midrash from female sources or
That's a really quick answer.
Yeah.
You know, I said it depends. It doesn't. No.
Because then that brings up
Oh, yeah.
how does from a woman's perspective,
Okay.
is Rachel always
I'm
wrong?
gonna. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's get to the end
Yeah.
and remember that this. Okay. So this whole lesson was from a woman, right? Speaking in modern times. So it isn't. So nowadays, today, are there women writing modern commentary? Yes, there are. Yes. Incredibly strong movement of women getting involved in women's learning, including in the Orthodox community. It is the issue of the day, right? This idea of bringing women's voices into the canon of textual, right? It is the issue of the day. And I'm going to reflect on this at the end of this piece. Okay, so yes, this source, the Ikeda Yitzhak, talking about the importance and the value of every individual, the fact that it was a man speaking when he was speaking is even more impressive than what he said. Okay, number 3, I think it's quite a difficult source actually, but I think he is saying something important. So just to clarify, it wasn't a typo. I didn't mean to write Rambam Maimonides and by accident wrote Ramban Nachmanides. They are 2 different people, 2 incredibly important different people that even Orthodox Jews get confused between. So I like using the Nachmanides and the Maimonides. It's clearer that it doesn't just rest on one extra little bump. Okay. So Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, what did he have to say? Who's in the wrong? Okay, it was Rachel. And what did she do wrong?
Spoke out of envy.
She spoke out of envy. And what was she asking Jacob to do?
To pray vehemently, to go ahead and put on sackcloth and repent and show humility towards God in order to get what she wanted.
Okay. And then what would happen? If he did these things, what was going to happen? he would be answered. In her head, if you pray, you will be answered. Right? It's a conveyor belt. Right? You put prayer of a righteous person in one end, you do the little bit of prayer, and at the end, you get yes, definitely, whatever you want, right? In this conveyor belt style. And that is what he gets annoyed about. Right? That you can't manipulate God. You can't force God to give you what you want. You can be the best human being you can be, and sometimes you get what you want. But you cannot force God to give you what you want. That's going back to the system of idol worship that they had left behind, where if you bring the right offering, if you give your son into the fire pit, if you defecate on a pyre, right, whatever it is that that particular god desired, then you will get what you want. You can manipulate the gods to give you what you need. And so Jacob gets annoyed. Oh, I know you think God functions like all those other gods that you left behind. God doesn't work that way. Sometimes the answer is no. Right? He's not annoyed that she thinks he hasn't been praying. He's right. That's not why he's annoyed. He's annoyed that she is undermining the system again, right? By bringing in her heretical idol worship ideas into the system. God can say no, right? Human beings are not in charge. God's in charge, right? Stop undermining the system. Okay. Last source. Did anyone get to the Midrash? Now I want you to know that this is the earliest source. Right? It comes from the Midrash. That means it's the earliest source. Who's in the wrong in the last source? If you came up with a theory, be confident and share it. I was eavesdropping.
Oh, I think Jacob was in the wrong because he got mad at Rachel, who was hurting and troubled, and as a result, his current children would be subservient to their future child.
Correct. Spot on. Right? Absolutely spot on. For the first, right, this is the first source where you see that it is Jacob who's in the wrong and not Rachel. And the reason he's on the wrong is because fundamentally, it doesn't matter what she did wrong, if somebody is in pain and hurting, it is your responsibility to be kind to them. And that's it. That's the approach the Midrash is saying. Bottom line, it doesn't matter. You can take your theology somewhere else. When somebody is in pain, your responsibility is to treat them with kindness and not to speak and not to respond to that pain with anger. You might think she's undermining your system. We don't care, say the rabbis in the Midrash. We don't care. What's important is how you treat other people when they're in trouble and when they're in pain. And the response has got to be with kindness. Now, this is Nechama Leibowitz's learning on this section. And Nechama Leibowitz was childless. So for her, this was not some random piece of Torah text. This was who she was. She was that woman in pain. She was that woman who could not have children, who wanted children all her life. And that is why she doesn't end her learning with the source of the Ikeda Yitzhak, which when we all read it went, oh, isn't this lovely? Women are valued, women have worth, women are creative human beings who contribute to society. Isn't that fantastic? Right? When we read that, we feel great. Finally, we're recognized. But that's not where Nechama ended her learning. She ended with the Midrash because she was that woman in pain. So for her, the text that spoke loudest to her was not one that valued everything that she had contributed to the world, but the one that recognized her pain and her struggle. A story was told to me by one of her students that students would go up to her and say, Nechama, you must be so happy and fulfilled because you don't just have a few children, you have tens of thousands of children because your students really look to you like a child does towards a parent. And Nechama's response was, and I would have given it all up to have one of my own. She really felt that pain so deeply, and she brought that to her learning. And that is why I think this is such a good example of what learning is about. That you bring yourself, yes, you explore the text, and yes, you understand that a text has multiple meanings, but you have to bring yourself to the conversation with God. Who are you and what are you going through, and what does the text have to say to you? It can say two things at once. We can say three things, four things at once. That yes, we think that monotheism is incredibly important, and that there's a system that values human beings in every shape, and that there's a system that recognizes the power of God over human beings, and at the same time, it recognizes that fundamentally we have to be kind. Right? So that is really a good example of how to learn a text in a Jewish way. We've got 5 minutes left. I want to just get to the end. No. Oh, there we go. Okay. I want to just talk about what actually happens in school, because I think it's an important conversation. It was brought up before. The idea that we do learn the text in the original, because there is we see that there's a sanctity to every single letter in the text. The choice of the spaces between the words is intentional, and therefore we can interpret even the spaces between the words as well as the words themselves. So seeing that can only be done in the original text, and therefore a lot of time is spent in a Jewish school context focusing on giving the students access and the tools that they need to access the text itself. So this is from our, we have departmental meetings, and we've been collaborating on really focusing in on what our goals are. What are our goals for the students? And if we're going to present a text, why are we presenting it? What are we doing in every single lesson throughout, from kindergarten through to the end of high school? Right? At what stage do we want them to acquire particular skills? What do we see as success? And we divided that up into various categories. So the first one is, and it always comes first, reading, translating, and understanding the Hebrew text of Tanakh. And a lot of time is spent on that. Vocabulary, and grammar are really important. It was something I discovered as an adult, that I love Hebrew grammar. My claim to fame is having got 9% in a Hebrew grammar high school quiz. It was not and now I teach it, right? So I can tell, that there's hope for us all, right? You can get past those moments, you can have success, you can get to a stage. I now love it because I think it's so powerful. It's, the systems and the structure of the Hebrew language is so powerful and so complex that it really speaks in a very powerful way. So I'm passing that on to the students, that they can have power over the text if they acquire these skills. Content knowledge. Right? What does it actually say? And importantly, what doesn't it say? Right? Those things are really important too. I always tell my students, knowledge is power. Right? When somebody says you have to do this because it says so, you're only going to be able to tell them to go away and leave you alone if you know that it doesn't say that, or if it says something different somewhere else. Right? You have to have, if the power is concentrated in people telling you what to do, you're always going to feel like you lack power. So take the power, learn the text, learn the skills, acquire it, know what it says. And then you can say, but it doesn't say that. Or, but it says that, something completely different somewhere else, right? It really acknowledges power. But it's also, it's the content that can inspire our connections. We have an analysis and interpretation, right? The idea that this is a living text. That as you learn the commentary, and they should learn the skills of learning these medieval, weirdly written commentaries, that they learn to find their own voices through that. That you learn that when there's a complexity to a text, the students themselves can learn that their own voice is part of that complex conversation. So that brings on to the last thing, which is connection and meaning making. That this all means something. That we're not learning this to be smart, to be intelligent, to know more than somebody else. We learn this because it's meaningful. And that their job as a student is to find, my job as a teacher is to help them facilitate, and their role as a Jew who learns is to find the meaning in that. And by meaning, what I really do mean, to go back to the beginning, is the voice of God. What you're doing, God is speaking to us through the text. So we, when we read it, need to find the voice of God. What's God saying to you today? And trying to bring that into the classroom when we're struggling with the Hebrew, and we're struggling with the vocab, and we're struggling with the grammar. And remembering that what we're doing this all for is to find that meaning in the process. Okay, thank you. So much more to say, so little time.